Hi, everybody. This is Bob Granito from IVP Research Labs, and welcome to another edition of Both Sides of the Mirror. I just want to explain what we mean by both sides of the mirror in case you haven't seen one of our previous episodes. So, what we mean by both sides of the mirror is, as you know, in market research today, technology plays an important role in the research process, and that usually happens in one of two ways. One is the research is going to take place regardless if there is any technology involved. But when technology is introduced into the process, it usually helps understand the user behavior and uncovers some additional learning from the research that may not have been possible without the technology. The other situation is when the technology is basically helping drive the research, right? And I'll talk about a couple of examples later on in the podcast. But what I mean by that is, let's say we're doing a shopping study and we need to know where someone's looking while they're shopping. We might add eye tracking to that equation, right? So the technology is playing an integral role in the process. I'd like to introduce my guest today is Lon Taylor, who I have worked with many years on many projects. And that's the reason why I brought him on board today, because Lon is from First Insights and he's been a qualitative and I think quantitative moderator for years. And of course, he is going to talk about the research side of things. Not only the research, but how technology plays a role in that as well. And I will probably elaborate on the technology side of things.
Thanks so much for having me. Very much appreciated. And I think that what I always try to do when talking to folks is kind of explain the big picture of where market research is at, why we're selecting a variety of different methodologies. And then today, I think we could talk about how the technology that you're providing comes into play and then why it's so important. So, big picture, user experience research, experiential research is really critical given the nature of the ever-changing business landscape that we are in. AI is changing everything. Real videos versus fake videos is changing things. People's perception of a brand can be changed, in an instant. And so we are engaging with participants that we do things like usability testing and focus groups and ethnographic research to really get a full understanding of where their heads are at and what they're thinking, what their perceptions are, what their behaviors are like when we do the research that we are conducting. And I think one of the other things is that there's always been a tendency, from my perspective, that quantitative data is more important. And in certain cases, it may be. But over the years that we've been in business, we always advocate for doing both qualitative and quantitative. The numbers just don't give you a full scope of customer feedback and customer perceptions. You have to get down into the details and really jump in. And where we partner, and I can start to give sort of the first example that comes to mind is sort of like a business to business example. So for those who are not in, let's say, the medical device or healthcare space, just a quick explanation. So the FDA in the United States requires that companies who have a medical device, and there's certain classes of medical device, but in general, almost all medical devices have to go through what's called a 510K application process. It's the companies spell out to the government and the FDA experts, here are all the different aspects of this product. It could be the electrical systems, it could be the software systems, it could be the way that an MRI scan works. or another, invasive medical tool works.
We did work on a couple of projects like that, right? Where there was an FDA mandate, right? We did a bunch of injection studies where they
Oh,
actually, the different manufacturers of the injector devices had to go through this mandate. And we supported that with technology. Obviously, we wanted to see the respondents and the participants actually doing a simulated injection, right? And it was really important that we had close-up images of the device itself, close-up images of the instructions on how to use the device, and so on and so forth.
yeah, you bring up a good point. Is that, again, thinking about this category of medical devices, it can be both for the consumer and a business to business play as well. Because we've done both as well. One of the bigger players in the diabetes pen marketplace came up with a completely new pen that is a lot easier to use than the old, sort of, put the needle in a bottle of insulin, and take it out, which
Sure.
those require refrigeration. So the whole process of educating the consumer and the diabetes patient became different. And one of the parts that we did, which was an early, sort of formative study, that didn't have to be shared with the FDA, was looking with patients at the directions for this new diabetes pen, to see if they understood it, and to see if the big benefit was that it doesn't need to be refrigerated as insulin did. So we're looking at things like that. Now, again, those are for a study like that, just using a single camera shoot, and or maybe a two camera shoot where you're looking down, and you may have helped us with this particular product where you're looking down at the actual product, but you're also seeing the customer's nonverbal communication and facial expressions as you're doing this. This is why our partnership is so important when we do something like this. It's having that two camera shoot. And the other example that I can share. So when you're dealing with, let's say, something that a physician has to use, or a medical technologist. So, an example could be, think about, how complex an MRI machine is, or a CT scan machine is, or even, we did something with a newly invented sort of pain medication tracking pump that a nurse could now track 10 or 12 patients, but it was a pretty complex interface. So in those cases, while it's the methodology is somewhat, when you're doing the one-on-one, it's you ask a few questions, but then you're setting it up as real usability testing and observational testing. So in those cases, we start the interview. It's a couple of introductory questions, and then that's it. And then we say, okay, imagine that this product came to you, go. And the participant has to figure out how to set it up, how to turn a
Right.
machine on, what the directions are telling them, without a moderator asking them too many questions, or any questions at all. Because the
Right.
real goal of the FDA 510(k) process when it comes to usability testing is, can a user operate a machine or use a medical device without help? Do they understand the instructions? So again, think of, in the case of a big piece of machinery or a surgical device, you want to capture what they're reading in a booklet or an instruction sheet. You want to, once they then turn it on, what button are they pushing? And then again, there are complex medical devices out there. There's software. There's the tactile, what they're touching to start, let's say, an MRI scan, and then finish it, and then what they're seeing. So that's where you come in, and I guess you can sort of elaborate on how many cameras you might use, and the importance of
Right.
also having an operator there to zoom in and zoom out.
Yeah, let me just touch on that real quick, Lon. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, the way it works for us is, a client comes to us most of the times not knowing what type of technology is going to help them satisfy their research objectives, right? They just know they have a need, right? So for me and for IVP, we're trying to understand that need, right? So we can best provide the technology that will satisfy that need, right? So whether that means multiple cameras and observing, whether that means capturing or measuring a physiological response, right? Like arousal, or using something like eye tracking, right? To understand where someone's looking. It's really not about at the top of the discussion, it's not about talking about technology. It's talking about what are we trying to learn from the research, right? And then you look at all the options that are available and you say, you know what? We have eye tracking. Yeah, that might be a good fit. We have facial coding. No, you know what? That's not going to work. They're not going to evoke enough emotion, right? Unless it's something that's funny or entertaining and whatnot. Um, so it's always, what we're trying to learn and how we can capture that data so we can understand that complete user experience, right? And as you know, Lon, it's not only what the participants say, because a lot of times they don't say much, right? It's how they're responding, um, how their emotions are being measured, how they're being observed as they're interacting with something. So it's sometimes it's nonverbal, as you mentioned. It's just understanding that nonverbal, behavior, right? And so you're measuring behavior if that's possible, right? And you're measuring in a lot of cases the emotional side of things, right? Um, and of course, we all know, yeah, that's only half the equation, right? The other half is the self-reporting part of it, right? But that usually happens after that experience is completed, right? You've observed it, you've seen some of the measures that we're taking, and then you can probe based on that data that we've collected, right, at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I think you described it very accurately, and you want to capture both sort of what we're observing, and then our experience is that in particular when we're interviewing, let's say, physicians and surgeons, these are really smart people. They don't want to necessarily tell you that they didn't understand something or that
Yeah,
they
right.
pressed the wrong button. So that, some of those questions come after the core usability part of that particular type of session. And again, it goes back to having the right methodology, understanding what you're trying to do. And again, there's differences between a formative and a summative study when you get to that. The summative, it has to be sort of spot on because the FDA can actually request the videos because if there is an issue. But um, moving to another example where again it's a different methodology, and I think you mentioned correctly that it's getting an understanding from our clients and the people we work with, who are marketers, researchers, innovation specialists, is understanding what they're trying to measure, and what their objectives are. So a good example of this is a project that we teamed up on, which was for a pretty young-ish cosmetics company that was growing like crazy. This company went from zero to like $100 million in sales in about a year, and so it was nuts. There was a lot of opinions from different people who were working for this newly assembled team of about 50 people, and they were trying to hire, and everyone was going nuts. And their website needed a lot of work. And their product was aimed at a younger female audience. So, about 16 years old up to maybe 29 years old. Um, and so what we decided to do was employ the technology to both capture what was going on a website. So again, one-on-one interview, for about an hour. We're bringing the participants in. Um, we selected, from my point of view, I wanted to have a female moderator do these because it just makes more sense. I think women talking about cosmetics and things like that to each other is a lot easier than a 16-year-old girl talking to me about the cosmetics that she might use. Might be a little intimidating to have a guy. So again, this is all part of our methodologies and understanding, how to employ the right technology and the right moderator for this. So I think we did both. If I remember, we had a couple of interviews where, and maybe about 15 interviews, and 6 or 7 were just on the website. I think we had some eye tracking, so you could
Right.
see where the participant was looking on the screen.
Right. What they see, what they don't see, which
Correct.
I always say, it's nice to know what they see, but what's more important is what they don't see, right? Like what content are they not seeing, right? And that definitely
Correct.
affects, their interaction with the website.
Yeah, and look, I think that one of the other things that's important is to bring context, especially when you're doing eye tracking. We've had debates and discussions about eye tracking and the value of eye tracking, and I think what it comes down to is making sure that in the reporting that it's explained what the context of the question was and where people's eyes go. Because if there's a big red dot on one word, you have to go back and look at the question and understand, okay, were they staring at that and it created the eye tracking, red area because they understood it, or they didn't understand it. So
Right,
that's
right,
where the marriage of the right question and the moderator's guiding going back. So that's a case where, again, you have to use the technology in the right way. You have to say, okay,
right,
let's go back and see what they actually did. Did they click on the
right.
wrong thing or not? Which, again, this is where you're so helpful in giving like a timeline. And then we can go back and listen to the particular question and then look at the rest of the pathway. In this case, it was some of the questions were a purchase pathway or looking at a particular product.
Right. And Lon, let me jump in here because I think this is really important. Um, you know, Obviously, as a technology provider, I understand what our role is in the process, and you as a researcher understands what your role in the process is. So for everyone else out there, just so they're clear, I understand that we are, meaning my company, is capturing the what of the behavior, right? Like, what did they do, right? We are not capturing the why, right? That is for the researcher to understand and to uncover, right? So the what is great, but it's only half the equation. Like you said, we see that their eye is looking somewhere and they're concentrating and their gaze is focused on this particular area. And that's the what behavior, right? That's what they're looking at and for how long and so on and so forth. But there's no way by looking at that data that we would know why they're really focusing on that area, right? Yeah, it could be because, hey, they're really interested in what they're looking at, or they're not sure what they're looking at, and maybe they're just trying to figure it out while they, run this through in their mind before they look somewhere else if they don't think they're in the right place. So yeah, it's really important that, there's that distinction between the what and the why, because you need both of those to really understand the full user behavior.
Definitely agreed. And I think the second part of this cosmetics uh, project included wearing sort of the eye tracking glasses, and that was super fun
Right.
because we're putting the glasses on, the women that we interviewed, and we also had, I think what we did, we also switched to a phone. So not only do we have the glasses, but we had them shopping on a phone because, again, this project was probably 6 or 7 years ago, when there was enough people shopping and buying things on their phone. It's only increased exponentially over the past 6 or 7 years that people are buying everything and on their phone.
Oh
But
yeah.
the
That,
value of that was seeing where people were going on their phone. And again, because of your technology, as people were swiping, you could see what they were swiping on. You could see how much they were scrolling. Um, and again, we're asking specific, open-ended questions about the product. But in that case, one of the great things was having them go through the actual purchase and e-commerce process. And as you know, and most of our listeners know, the shorter and easier you can make an e-commerce process, the more sales you're going to have. You're going to close on these. If you make the e-commerce process too long and you ask for too much information, you get abandonment. So it really does matter. And having the technology to see where the user was looking, and then combined with what we were asking them, timing that e-commerce process, all these things were super helpful to the client who continues to grow their business. I think they're up to something close to $1 billion in sales now, which is nuts. But it was helpful, and it came at a critical time. And again, this is where having an open-minded client, to bring in the right technology, to
Right.
participate in developing the moderator's guide. Everybody is aiming towards the same goal. How do we acquire new customers? How do we become more successful? In some cases, it may be, again, in the medical device, how do we get approval for this device and make sure that the device is easy to use? All of these factor into putting the right team together for the research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I mentioned earlier that, when we have conversations with the client, sometimes they throw out terminology or a technology that they want to utilize. And I don't want to say we disregard that, but again, we go deeper into the conversation to understand what they're trying to learn from the research. Because to be honest, I would say in probably about half of the projects we work on, the technology changes along the way during the conversation. It's like, well, we thought we needed facial coding, or at least sometimes the client thought they needed facial coding or eye tracking or whatever. And as we uncover what we're really trying to learn from the research, that changes when the conversation is over and we agree on, the research is going to start and, launch and so on. So, it's really important, and I keep stressing it over and over again with every conversation I have with the client. And sometimes the client is not on the call. It's like I may be talking to Lon, right, as a research consultant, and you're basically telling me what the client told you. And I'm like, okay, it probably really important that we get the client on the line with us, right? So we all have that conversation together. So you don't have to try to interpret what they think they want, and then we try to interpret what you think they want, and we think they want, and it's a mess. So yeah, that conversation is extremely important. It adds to so much more success with the project, I can't even tell you. And I'll be totally transparent. I have worked on projects where we were brought into the equation at the end of the food chain, right? And all we could basically do was say, yes, we'll support the research with what you've already outlined. And at the end of the day, there was feedback that we were missing, right? The clients just felt like they didn't learn what they really wanted to learn. And that really just goes back to, it didn't start the way it should have started, right? So at the end of the day, we think we could have done a much better job had we all had, been on the same page and had that conversation. So I know you've probably been through that, Lon, with a bunch of different clients over the years where you basically have to do what they want and they don't really take a lot of input, unfortunately. But I totally encourage that because it just makes for a much better project and everyone walks away much happier at the end when a project's over.
Yeah, we've definitely, there can always be challenges. Again, some of these projects come up pretty quickly, and there are deadlines. There's a timeline to be that has to be met. And from our perspective, what we try to do, and again, this is just good advice for any researcher who's out there, is really work hard to get all of the stakeholders bought in at the beginning of the project.
Right.
And those things are, as simple as making sure everyone signs off on the screener. making sure everyone knows exactly who they want to be participating in this research. And then the same thing with the moderator's guide. Get the technology folks, the programming folks, the visual design folks, copy folks, content folks, get all these people involved because one or two of them may have a different perspective, and that can help dictate uh, what equipment may be needed to bring in to help the research along. I think that over the years, you know, you'll get some clients that will debate over the cost of, of using more equipment and the technology and the video. I mean, from my perspective, the cost has come down over the years. And big picture, some of these big companies, it is worth it to spend a couple of extra $1,000 to have the right technology and the right cameras included for this research. It just, nitpicking over a few $1,000 doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Lon, I've bid on a bunch of projects, right? And when I'm bidding on a project, I feel totally confident that what we're going to provide is the perfect fit for the research, right? I actually get excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we provide. This is right in our wheelhouse. We're going to win this project, no doubt. We're going to give them exactly what they're looking for. And then they come back and they go, well, they've changed direction. They're going in a different, they're going in a different direction. I'm like, what? How could that possibly be? Either they had to change the research or they're missing out on all this valuable insight that we could have provided. And, not, of course, I wanted to get the job, but I feel bad because I want to add to the research, right? I want to add value to the research. And when I have that opportunity, I get excited. I'm gung ho and the whole bit. And then when it doesn't happen, I'm like, wow, they're missing out on so much. So, obviously, that's a disappointment, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a research standpoint. I'm like, oh my gosh, we could have done so much better. I never get to see what the final product was, or what the report looked like at the end of the day, because we weren't involved in the study. But I know for a fact they shortchanged, for whatever it was, if it was for money or whatever, that it definitely affected the research, negatively. At least that was my take on it. Because again, it seemed like such a perfect fit. I couldn't believe that they didn't go forward with it.
Yeah, and look, it could be budget, it could be other, that methodologies switch. And I think that again, for clients who may be listening to this, be open-minded, and just ask for that little bit extra in budget that's going to help get you there. And again, we've had these discussions because, look, no one has an unlimited budget for this type of market research. And sometimes we've had to sort of split it in the middle. So if we expected to have, 2 full days of one-on-one research, we would team up for 1 out of the 2 days. And at least you get some of that perspective. Um, and you're saving a little bit of money, but the point of the research is to really dig into these questions and learn so you can make smart decisions. And
Right.
sometimes even with 1 day and 7 or 8 participants using the technology, the eye tracking, the glasses when you're looking at a phone or another interface, or things like shopping studies when you're actually doing ethnographic research, it makes a huge difference. Look, one of the things that we know is that market research participants, when you ask them to self-report, they can't remember what happened yesterday. And so, in a shopping study, having the video in someone's glasses and seeing what they're seeing,
Right.
that's the what did they do part of this. And then they're reporting on what they thought of a particular brand, where an item was on the shelf, and you need both of those aspects of the research to really inform those decision making discussions that are going on out there.
Yeah, that's a great example on. And I think that goes back to, the whole reason why we're having this podcast, which is called Both Sides of the Mirror. And I could tell you, we've worked on, dozens and dozens of eye tracking studies, shopping studies with eye tracking glasses. And one of the techniques that is available is playing back the video that was just recorded, right? So you can do a retrospective think aloud, right? The participant, you mentioned trying to remember what they did during that shopping exercise. Well, there's really no need to do that, right? The technology will help them remember, right? So you play back the video and they go, oh yeah, yes, I remember looking over there because this, whatever reason, whatever attracted my attention, I looked over there. And oh no, if there was like a specific element that, the client per se wanted to know if it was seen or not seen, and they go, no, I never looked in that direction, and this is what helps when you do this retrospective think aloud. It's like adds just another layer of insight. So, they don't have to remember what they did. The technology helps them remember, right? And then from a research standpoint, obviously, you can ask a lot more questions and do a lot more probing. And again, I go back to what I said before, looking at the what and filling in the why, right? Side of the equation. And that's the critical part. Then I know we're almost out of time, so this might be a good time for us to wrap up, but it's a perfect example of both sides of the mirror working together to add an additional layer of feedback and value to the research. It's when they come together, they complement each other so well that everyone walks away with a smile on their face. You agree, Lon? Because you're
Abs-
smiling right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's look, it's a team effort, with the clients and the stakeholders, with with the researchers team, with the technology folks, and the technology and the expertise that you bring to the table. Um, and again, I urge clients to be open minded, and if they haven't used this technology, try it for one day of research, and see what happens. And if you haven't used this, and again, I can almost guarantee that every time we've used the technology, the right technology, that we're getting something in value that is enhanced by using the right equipment. And
Yeah,
for the
exactly.
most part, almost all of the clients will see that as well. And when they go back and they're doing planning for future research, they will understand why it's so critical to add a couple extra $1,000 into the budget for this, because it really does make a difference, and they can make a stronger case to their senior management as to why we should go in one direction or another direction. So yeah, absolutely agree. And look, this is why we're both still enthusiastic about what we do. We're not spring chickens anymore. We're doing this for a while, and it's still fun because in part
No, it is.
when we started doing this, the iPhone didn't exist,
I know.
and
It's like I mentioned
were
earlier.
yeah,
Yeah,
websites were a brand new thing.
when a client comes to me and says, "Here's what we're trying to learn from the research," and I go, "Oh my God, we have so many options available," right? And then we start adding things like, "Okay, we're going to do eye tracking to understand the eye gaze behavior. We're going to add some GSR, which is galvanic skin response, right? Because we want to measure the level of arousal, right? So all these elements get added. I just get more and more excited because I'm like, oh my God, this is going to provide us with so much feedback. So, we welcome those opportunities. I know you do as well, Lon. And, again, bottom line is at the end of the day, when you put the combination of technology and research together, the right way, meaning the right methodology, the right technology, and the right questions that we're going to ask, right? It's an amazing process, and again, everyone walks away with a smile on their face. Sound good?
All good to me.
All right, Lon, thank you so much for participating today to this installment of Both Sides of the Mirror. And until next time, this is Bob Granito at IVP Research Labs and Lon Taylor from First Insight saying, have a good day.